So since the boys have released a new series, I thought it'd be best to share with you how you can make your own Starlight cosplay at home. It's super easy to make and only requires a few fabrics. So in this video, I'll be covering the best fabrics to use, the quickest way to cut your fabric, and the easiest way to sew your Starlight costume. So what are the best fabrics to use? In my case, I decided to use a white scuba for the main panels on this costume. The scuba still has a similar stretch to lycra, but it's just a bit thicker, so it looks a bit more structured. But although that fabric was structured, it did seem a bit transparent. So what I did was I backed it with this Powermesh, which did reduce the stretch a tiny bit, but it just allowed the costume to keep its shape a bit better. So the next fabrics that I got were all of the gold panels. So for this one, I decided to go for a lycra that had a bit more of a matte sheen to it, just because I thought that looked a bit more polished. And then I wanted to have the bindings be quite eye-catching, so I did use a nice metallic lycra just to make those pop. So this section here was just a cuff band that I got from eBay. When you're working with stretch materials, I always recommend to check the directions and the amount of stretch that each fabric has and see if they work well together. Just so that you know when you've actually made the costume that you can get it on and off. Now to go through just some things that can help you speed up the cutting process. For these fabrics, I'd recommend using a rotary cutter to cut them. You can still use some scissors, but the rotary cutter means that your fabric is lying flat and there's no chance of you stretching the fabric before it's cut. And if you're using a rotary cutter, you want to make sure you have a cutting board so that you're not damaging any surfaces that you're going to be putting your fabric on. And the final thing you'll need is some fabric weights. You want to make sure you get some good heavy fabric weights so that you're not knocking your patterns about, especially when you're cutting. And these are just some tips to make the cutting process a bit quicker. So now for the make, you want to start by placing the fabric on your cutting mat. Start by cutting out the white panels first for this costume. And you're just going to use the rotary cutter to go around the shape of each panel. And you're going to do the same for every single piece. Now once you've got your white panels done, start doing it for the gold panels as well. For the Powermesh, you want to cut the same panels that are for the white and make sure that you have a sharp rotary cutter. As you can see here, I was struggling quite a bit with it, but that was just because my blade was a bit blunt. So once you've got your panels cut out, I then use the Speedball ink, which stretch with the fabric to print my stars on. I do have a full video that covers that, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But you can get a fabric that already has the stars printed on, or you can do it yourself if you'd like. But as you can see here, I just spread that across a acetate template, and then I'll repeat that all the way down each pattern piece. This is the longest part of the costume, but if you're making it with a material that's already printed, it's definitely a lot quicker. But once you've got those 5 panels cut out, you should have them looking like this. So with those all cut out, you're then going to attach the Powermesh to the wrong side of your white fabric. And you're just going to do this by basting it together. Now to baste the fabric, all you're going to do is a running stitch and then tie it off at the end by doing a back stitch instead of doing a knot, because you'll end up taking these threads out after it's overlocked. So all you're going to do is stitch through the both of them and do that along all of the edges so that it's held nicely in place. And you are going to do this for every single white panel. So once again, just do a simple running stitch going across all of the edges, and once you get to the end, finish it with a back stitch rather than a knot. But once you have those pieces, they should be looking something like this. So then how do you sew the panels together? And the way I did it was I started from the back and made my way all the way around to the front, since the finishes were on the front. So what you can do is start with the 2 back panels with right sides together and baste that into place so it doesn't slip. You can also just peg it into place if you prefer, but I always decided to tack it just so it wasn't getting dragged or pulled out of place. It's also not fully necessary to have a seam here, but when I was doing my fittings with my models, to get the shape against the body, I had to add that extra seam on the back. But it's up to you whether you would like that or not. But once you've got that sewn into place, you're then going to just take it to the overlocker and connect those 2 pieces together. Next is then to sew your side panels on, and you're just going to do the same as that centre back seam of basting it and then putting it through the overlocker. So this section has a tiny bit of a curve, so just be careful that none of your fabric gets caught. So once you've got your 2 side panels connected to the back panel, want to add your golden strips for the binding that just go on the hip. Now these bias bindings don't have to be cut on the bias because it's a stretch fabric, so you can just cut out simple strips. But then once again, you're going to put that right sides together, baste it into place until you get to the crotch seam. Then what I did was put this gold hip panel on top of the gold binding so that that was sandwiched in between the white and the hip panel, and just basted that together. And once again, just take that to the overlocker, making sure you're not cutting. But once you're done with that, you can then fold over the bindings and then fold them under themselves to add that top stitch. So what I'm using here is a top stitch foot, and you can get this for domestic sewing machines as well, but if you don't want to invest in one, you can make sure that you're just taking it slow and making sure that line is even, and you're gonna do this for either side. Then the next binding to put into place is the one that's on the princess seam on the front, so this one that curves round the chest down into the stomach. So once again, you're gonna base it into place, but slightly differently than how you put this one in. You're gonna put the wrong side against the right side of the white fabric, and I would recommend for this binding that you cut the shape of that seam itself that is being attached to, so that it sits nice and flat. And you're just going to attach that until you get to the end. So with that gold panel basted into place, I then sandwiched it in between the white front panel for the leotard and the side panel, once again finishing it under the overlocker. Make sure definitely for this one that you are moving the fabric out of the way of the blade, because it is on a curve and is a bit more likely to get caught. If you don't have an overlocker at home, you can also put this costume together by using a zigzag stitch on your normal sewing machine. I just like to use an overlocker because it finishes off the edging. And with both the front attached and the binding in place, you're going to do the same as the hip binding and just sew it down with the tops. So now we've attached these white panels together and these hip panels, it's then time to move on to adding the zip into place. So for this, you're just going to hand stitch the zip into place to make it easier. And then what I did was I added a tearaway interfacing onto the lycra so that when it was going through the machine, it wasn't getting stretched as I was sewing along it. So this is what it should look like once you've got your first stitch in. So here's me just adding in the zip. I did 2 stitches, one to hold it in place initially, and then another one just a bit closer to the opening of the zip so that it sit nicely on the lycra. And with that in place, you just want to tear away that interfacing. It does come off quite easy, but you might just need to get some tweezers to get some of the smaller bits that get stuck in the thread. Then with that done, you just need to finish that zip with a little top stitch. As you can see here, I'm not using a top stitch foot, I'm just making sure that I'm going slowly along that zip. And I'm sorry about the state of my hands here. I was spray painting the boots before I did this part on the costume. And then with the zip in place, you just want to baste that onto the front panel. Then you're just going to zigzag stitch that in place. I decided to definitely zigzag stitch this part because trying to get under the overlocker was quite fiddly and I really didn't want to risk cutting the costume in half by accident. Once that's in place, you want to add the binding to the edges of your costume. This is just the gold lycra folded in half and basted along that edge. These are then just put under the overlocker. So you should have a binding on either hip section and along the neckline. So for the binding on the neckline, you're just going to do the same, starting from where the collar will be placed all the way around to the other side. So then you should be left with your costume looking like this. And then what you want to do is attach your collar pieces. So you should have 2 different size collar pieces, one that will go over the other, and for either you want 2 panels. So for the collars, you're just gonna put them right sides together and stitch very close to that edge. You can hold these into place with some pegs just so you're not leaving holes in your lycra, and you're gonna do that for either side of the collar. So if the tops of the collars sewn, you then want to attach the front of the collars to the leotard. Now this is with right sides facing each other so that this is a little hidden stitch, and you're just going to do this with a small little straight stitch up until you get to the end of the binding. I forgot to mention as well, before putting your collar in, I did add some elastic just into that binding just by pulling it through with a little safety pin. You don't have to add the elastic, but I just thought it would make it hold nicer on top. I then folded over the edging and tacked that into place to encase the raw edge in. And once you're done with that, just top stitch all the way around. So as you can see here, I'm just giving it a nice slow straight stitch to finish it off. So now you've got the collar attached, you've only got 2 steps left, and that's to attach this binding and to sew up the crotch. To sew up the crotch, all you have to do is put the 2 pieces together and overlock it. Whereas for the binding, I decided to fold over the edges and just tight that into place. So before you stitch it to the leotard, just make sure it's placed where you want it to be sitting. So to finish, you're just going to top stitch on either side, same as before, and definitely take your time with this part because you're working with the entire costume under the sewing machine, so it can get a bit fiddly at times. But once you're done with that, you'll have yourself your Starlight cosplay. I hope this video helps with how you can recreate this costume at home, and if you're interested in any of my commission work, I'll put a link in the description below where you can contact me. But if you're interested in how I made Starlight's boots and gloves, or any of my upcoming projects, be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.